Thanks, Jared. It's great to be here with you and with everyone this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds
Okay,
good.
great. So I'll be speaking primarily today from my own LDS Christian perspective, my work as a historian, and the 10 plus years I've spent in interfaith and interspiritual engagement with people from a spread of religious, secular, and spiritual backgrounds and perspectives. Just a quick disclaimer up top. While I dip into scriptures and general conference talks, what I'm sharing today are my own personal views and not the views of the church or any organization, employer, or campaign with which I am affiliated. Today, I'm going to discuss first the connection in LDS thought between being righteous and prospering in the land, and then explore what LDS commitments should be in two prongs of how we think about federally protected land. First, general disputes over public lands and the specific needs to protect sacred lands. To begin today, a core message of the Book of Mormon is that if we're righteous, we, quote, prosper in the land. And one of the great temptations for Latter-day Saints, much like Nephites before us, is to misread this framework and thus misread what our relationship with the land and water and air ought to be. And I realize that to a certain amount, I am preaching to the choir here, but as the great Toby Ziegler once said during an episode of West Wing, this is how you get the choir to sing. So I personally find the Book of Mormon fascinating because while Joseph Smith taught that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book, it is also an account of societies that failed. These failures are laid out clearly in the dynamics of the pride cycle. I also tend toward a different sort of reading of Mormon 9:31. Here's Moroni, one of the times he thought he was closing out the record, asking us not to condemn him or his father or earlier writers because of their imperfections. Instead, he encourages us when we see these imperfections to give thanks to God for letting us see these imperfections because it allows us to be wiser than they were. There's a tendency sometimes to read this verse as wry irony. How could we ever measure up to the prophets of the Book of Mormon? But given what was going on in Moroni's life, what he had seen, the anguish he so clearly carried with him, I believe Moroni was sincere and afraid that we would reject the whole story because of their failures. I mention these readings because the dynamic between being righteous and being blessed in the land, or keeping the commandments and prospering in the land, as is laid out in Alma 9:13, is very easy to proof text or wrest in rather dangerous ways. The first is a theology of a vending machine God, where we pay with obedience checklists and receive money in return, or even worse, use our own financial security as evidence that we are keeping the commandments. The prosperity gospel approach that I feel pretty safe judging as heresy. What's more, I've seen fellow Latter-day Saints parse 2 Nephi chapter 1, one of the more detailed explanations of this covenant, to justify the so-called doctrine of domination, a heretical misreading of the Great Commission of Matthew 28, to see it as a command to spread Christianity by the sword, or to use the apparent lack of religious commitment by others to deprive them of their own liberty. This has been used across history to justify the transatlantic slave trade, European colonialism in a lot of domains, including settler colonialism in the United States and across the Americas in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. 2 Nephi 1 can also be taken to justify a radical laissez-faire libertarianism, an unchecked quote-unquote liberty for those with power and means, rather than the liberty that comes from a society working together for the general welfare. Development is freedom, as Amartya Sen put it, and which Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith's Dictator's Handbook shows, depends on broad-based democratic participation, including support for the poor, wise joint stewardship of land and natural resources, and seeking to live peaceably, humbly, and inclusively in a diverse society built on justice and fairness. Finally, peacemaking is a core theme of the Book of Mormon and cannot be divorced from this covenant. I see peacemaking in the frame famously laid out by Dr. King in his letter from Birmingham jail as not the absence of tension, but rather the presence of justice. All right, so with all that said, what should the Latter-day Saint Christian approach to the land, and especially public lands, actually be? First off, we shouldn't be bound to tradition, partisan political arguments, or particular tropes of agrarian masculinity, and we should recognize when other people are. While public land is most common in the interior West, I note that over half of California is public land, and that Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, and even New Jersey all rank in the top 20 states for percentage of land that is in the federal government's hands. I'm here today as a North Carolinian. We're 26th in public land, 15% of our state's area, And it's just not on the political radar in the same way that it is in Utah, Arizona, Idaho, Oregon, Nevada. It's not a continual flashpoint. And when it is out west, it's often more about settler colonial identity politics and the doctrine of domination than Christianity per se. It means these fights are about money, power, and status. Among Anglo-Americans, setting aside public lands tends to be most controversial among ranchers and people with a financial stake in extractive industries like oil, gas, and mining. As Joshua Specht, historian at Notre Dame, points out, one reason some ranchers dislike public lands so much is because ranching in general, and cattle ranching specifically, is a great way to grab a lot of land for oneself. This is his book, Red Meat Republic. Certain ranchers present these land grabs along with an Ammon Bundy-like distress when they have to pay even minimal rents to graze their cattle on the public's land, with a lot of talk about liberty, stewardship, and how we should just trust and support their dreams to, well, own lots of land and sell lots of meat. These same arguments also happen, we hear them from oil, gas, and other mining interests, but there's no porterhouse steak at the end, so there's less romanticism involved. They'll make claims about jobs, but I think this is a very narrow view of jobs and economic development alike. So many of these debates about public land are, at the end of the day, political arguments about access to money and power and resources, which means that we have to turn to the LDS ethic of politics. And by this, I do not mean vote Republican. Here are 4 principles I see as undergirding the ethic of what it means to be politically engaged Latter-day Saints. The first principle is just we should be engaged. Latter-day Saints should not debate or discuss partisan politics within our meeting houses or within the context of ward life, but we are obligated to participate in civic life, including the functioning of a pluralistic democracy. I think here especially of Doctrine and Covenants 58, the revelation given to the Colesville Saints, including the point that we should not sit around and wait to be commanded in all things, but rather be anxiously engaged in a good cause and do many things of our own free will and bring to pass much righteousness. In this engagement, we must be reflective and thoughtful about how we approach any question of public policy, to neither refuse new information nor to shirk away from that engagement. Principle 2, people are welcome to speak, and we're welcome to listen. But as Latter-day Saints, we should look at what people do rather than just what they say. Show you my faith by my works, judge by the fruits. Or as Joseph Smith put it after hearing about a family who lost their property in a fire, I feel sorry for this brother to the amount of $5. Principle 3, we work political questions out in the public sphere through the constitutional democratic system we are ever perfecting. President Oaks reiterated 5 key pillars of the system during the April 2021 General Conference. They are 1, the source of government power is the people. 2, power is delegated between different levels of government. 3, power is further split between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, which is something that I know the Utah State Legislature has been struggling with as a concept. The North Carolina State Legislature has been struggling as well. 4, we enjoy vital guarantees of individual rights and limits of government authority. 5, we're to be governed by laws, not individuals. We should be equal before the law and accountable to it and support the separation of powers. The 4th principle in this ethic is that we are not under a divine or ecclesiastical mandate to support a particular party or politician. In fact, this past June, the church's first presidency reiterated merely voting a straight ticket or voting based on tradition without careful study of the candidates and their positions on important issues is a threat to democracy and inconsistent with revealed standards, and pointed to the standard in Doctrine and Covenants 98 of supporting people we consider to be honest, wise, and good. Nowhere in these 4 principles is we must provide public funds to pay for someone's dream to own lots of land and or sell us lots of meat. Or as my wife Sarah says on the campaign trail, folks are free to pursue their dreams, but we don't have to have taxpayers fund them. Now, not all of the debates about public lands are exclusively about access to money or power. And we're going to be talking about this much more today, but here I want to touch on why the creation of these new monuments in Utah and Arizona should be particularly important and celebrated by Latter-day Saints. The LDS commitment to freedom of religion stretches back to at least the 11th article of faith. We claim the privilege of worshiping according to the dictates of our own conscience and allow all the same privilege, let them worship how, where, or what they may. Historically, the United States has done a terrible job of respecting the religious liberty of Native individuals and nations. Forced removals, residential schools, deliberate disruption of language and cultural transmission between generations, and a very narrow view by Christian leaders, law schools, and the federal government, including the Supreme Court, of which religious and spiritual practices count under the First Amendment, have combined to reduce the ability of Native nations to use freedom of religion arguments to protect their access to and protection of sacred lands. Over the last 10 years, in part due to the rise of social media, Native individuals and tribes have been able to raise greater awareness across the United States and around the world about threats to sacred lands from, especially, oil and gas development. Most notable was the effort by youth from the Standing Rock tribe to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline from running under a lake on their reservation, construction that also threatened sacred lands. In the closing months of President Obama's administration, the Army Corps of Engineers blocked the project, but that was reversed the next month by the Trump administration. One of the most prominent current disputes is over Oak Flat in Arizona, which Ambassador Jeff Flake, when he was a senator, partially opened to mining despite its sacredness to many Arizona tribes. This background is important for recognizing the significance of the Biden-Harris administration protecting sacred lands in Arizona and Utah. While definitions of freedom of religion differ, there's no universally agreed upon standard. If Latter-day Saints believe that we are all alike unto God, then we should take claims to sacrality as seriously as we expect them to be taken. Just this past week, when Pakistan's ambassador to the United States asked Elder Dieter Uchtdorf for the location of LDS Christians' Mecca, he replied, "You might say we have many Meccas. Our temples are our places of most sacred worship." According to a recent poll, 73% of Latter-day Saints say they feel a, quote, deep spiritual connection with nature. The least we can do is respect when our neighbors say the same and extend some understanding, if not celebration or appreciation, when people win long-sought protection of the lands they hold sacred. Thank you.